My name is Lincoln Norton, and we're here today to talk about an exhibit about my father, Thomas Akin Norton, who, if he were alive today, would be 99 years old next year. He was born in 1922 in Long Island, and he moved to Switzerland when he was a young man. And I'm going to tell some funny stories, and we're going to move around the exhibit. And really, before I start, I want to thank La Grua for hanging this show. And I'd also like to thank everyone who contributed materials. And you know who you are. And those materials, I think, have made a very lovely show. And my daughter, Davy, who's a graphic designer, designed the panels, which are going to be too small to read, but I'll read the pertinent details from them. So let's start here. This first section is called Biography. And in this biography section, we have a couple of his books, some of his poetry, and he was quite a Renaissance man. And these are symbols of some of the work he did. This is something he did for me, which is called a Brahmastan, which is the center point in a house. And when we worked on a house together, for me, he designed this and I had it built. But it's to mark, you could think of it as the belly button of a house, where you're not supposed to step or put anything. It's kind of like, they call it the Brahmastan, or the place for God. And this is his book of short stories, Sound of Colors, and a story about him in Providence Journal, and a half model that he used to build when he was doing his boat designs, and one of his poems about, he used to ham it up quite a bit, and that's him hamming it up with a tricorn hat. We also have, to the right here, we have a poem that he did in his book of poetry, People, Times, and Places. And this poem is in the book, and it goes with this picture of his boat crossing the finish line during a race. And I'll talk more about his boat trilogy. This is trilogy. And the prayer, it's called Prayer. And it says, Lord, let me sail the whole race through. Pray do not sink me yet. Let me cross the finish line with all my canvas set. So that is his sort of wish for his end of his life. And I'm going to he went to Columbia, and he graduated in World War II. He flew B-17 bombers. So he graduated on the GI Bill when he returned from the war in 1949. And he became an architect and graduated from architecture school and in 1949. And I was born in 1945, just as the war ended. This next section, I want to talk about his house in Chester. And as I said, I came to Stonington because of when he lived in Chester, Connecticut, which is nearby. There's a great story about this house. He was driving along in 1979 looking for a place to live, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees this 1827 abandoned house that was being used to store pipes. And he stops his car, slams on the brakes, gets out, goes in and asks the factory owners if they would sell it to him, and they said yes. So he had it moved and restored. He moved it onto the lot next door and restored it. But it's fascinating because when we get to the architecture section, you're going to see he was originally a Bauhaus architect. And when he found this classic house in Chester, it shifted him from a Bauhaus architect, modernist, which pretty much everyone who graduated in his era was, to a classicist. And when we get to the other architecture in Chester, you'll see he was very enamored with the classical Greek revival period. And of course, this is a very good example of Greek revival architecture. I want to go back and talk a little bit about his mother. When he lived in Switzerland, I have given La Grua an image of his mother, who was married 5 times. She was a kind of an anti-Mame character. And he used to tell the story about her. And there were 3 stories that I think are wonderful. One is that she used to like to ride in the, he called her a holy terror. And she used to like to ride in the Swiss countryside with the top down. And she'd breathe deeply and say, "Ah, manure," as if that was a good thing to experience. She also, when her 4th husband died, she inherited a little bit of money from him. And they were at the funeral and they said, "Mrs. Norton, it is so sad about your husband." She said, "Yes, but he did leave me a little something." And what she meant was that he had left her 40,000 Swiss francs. And at that time, she lived in Switzerland in Lausanne, and in a wing of the Beau Rivage Hotel. And the next morning, a limousine came and picked her up. And 2 weeks later, an ambulance delivered her back, suffering from gout, penniless. She had spent all the money on a spree across Europe, ending up in Baden-Baden at the gaming tables where she had lost the last sou that she had. And the last story is that when my mother and father, as teenagers, married, and of course this is World War II era, 1941, my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, and Joan Kemenick, she was 100% German, her name was Kemenick, maiden name was Kemenick, used to be at parties together. And my father's mother, Joan, would throw the glass, after drinking a toast, she would throw the glass in the fireplace. And my maternal grandmother, who was very conservative, would say, "You know, Mrs. Norton, we don't throw the baccarat." So that was kind of, she was a bit wild. And I think some of that rubbed off on my father. And I think, one of the things that's fascinating about him is that he was always being creative. And I think some of that came from his mother. It was very interesting. Anyway, Frank, let's look at the Chester and switch places here. So this is a building which you can see today in Chester, and it was an old building, and my father added these wings and addition, and this is him hamming it up. He was such a ham, and when we get to the theater part, you'll understand why. But he did these additions for Jan and Peter that was very much in tune with the original part of the building. And this is what it looks like today. It's quite lovely. So one last thing, on the table here, there are some sketches and the house in Chester, which he made when he was doing the renovation. And of course, when he did the ink wash elevations and so on, that is a kind of an old-fashioned way of doing architectural rendering. Let's go see the theater part. So the next period, what I've done is organize some of his theater activity. He was fascinated with the idea of being an actor, and he acted, he did set design architecturally, he helped build sets, and he was in movies and television and so on as an amateur actor. So he played, among other things, he played the architect of the Hagia Sophia for the Discovery Channel. And he was very, very active. This is from his days acting in the Chester Meeting House, The Importance of Being Earnest, where he was an actor. And we will see that over here is a model he did for the Picasso at the Pan Ajil. And what's lovely about this is that this is the painting, and halfway through the show, this fell down and showing that Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of Picasso. So he would build this set, he would design the set and build the models, and of course he would provide the construction. The next panel you'll see some elevations he did of different plays. This is called Amy's View, and it was for the players in Providence. And the next one is called The Night Must Fall, and it was also for Providence. It was another play he did the sets for, and he did it for the Crucible and some others. So the next section we're going to talk about is architecture. And as I said earlier, he started his career when he graduated in 1949. He worked for a number of well-known architecture firms, usually as head of design. And as a young man, he worked for Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill, SOM. And he also was head of design for Sherwood, Mills, and Smith, both major New York firms. And this is a house that he did for Wilbur Mills in 1956, which still stands. It's a lovely house, and it's a modernist house. It's called Mills 2. It's in New Canaan, Connecticut. And next to it, you'll see his house, which is unfortunately now torn down, which he also started designing in 53 and moved in 56. And it was a black brick modernist house in Bedford, New York, on Hook Road. And again, this was his sort of Bauhaus period, where which he continued up into the 50s, and it was really in the 60s he continued to do that kind of work. So in 53 he moved to Bedford, New York, and then in 63 he formed his own firm in Stamford, Connecticut called Norton and Hume. And when he was at Norton and Hume, he did some very well-known buildings. In 1973, he moved to New York and started work at Rockefeller Center. He sold his interest in Norton and Hume. And while at Rockefeller Center, he was head of design for many, many years. And these are some illustrations he did of his work in New York. Hand-drawn again. We'll get back to Rockefeller Center when we get to the Christmas card he did for them. But as he left New York, he moved north. So he came to Chester in 1979, and we've seen his house in Chester, which he found in 1979. And then he did a lot of work as a classicist. He became fascinated by Palladio, and you'll see when we get to some of the elevations he did in those years, in the early 80s, they were very, very influenced by Palladio, the Italian architect Palladio. He also worked for a short time for Ben Thompson of Design Research, and he worked on the South Street Seaport and Maxwell Plum's in Ghirardelli Square and Marimekko's store on Fifth Avenue. So he was active in New York at that time. And when he came north, let's go see some of the Palladio elevations he did. So this is it was never built. It was a concept for a footbridge that is based on sort of a classical design. The next one was a house he actually built in Old Lyme, which was built around a farmhouse. So he really took this farmhouse and buried it it was built, but it was buried inside of this elevation. There's an old farmhouse. The next is again a conceptual that he did of a bell tower, which he was really just exploring concepts. Again, I doubt that was ever built. I think he just was enjoying himself. And I'm sure this next one was never built because it was called Villa Minima, homage to Palladio. And it was, again, just an exercise in if he were to build a Palladian villa, what would it look like? The next one was a concept house. As you know, Palladio had, when Palladio was active and he would go to Vicenza, the Venetians would get hot in the summer and pestilent, and they would float their goods up the river to Vicenza. So this is a concept of a residence in Hadlime along the Connecticut River. And this is the river elevation of it, and this is the front elevation of it. And again, it's a concept house, very, very much like a Palladian villa, backed up to the river, but he couldn't resist the idea that the river was behind it, and therefore it, in theory, was similar to the kind of villa that Palladio would have designed. Around this time, having left Rockefeller Center, he was in private practice, and this is an example of a client that he did in 1983. This is a house that he did for a client in Essex. So he was doing private residence and other kinds of designs for private clients, individual clients. Now we move into the art section, and I have to say we put the birdhouse, it's called the birdhouse because the story behind it is that originally it was, and it comes apart, he built it. Originally it was, he entered into a birdhouse contest, and once he started, this is the Villa Rotunda of Palladio, and once he started working on it, he said, I'm never going to let the birds go in it. So he built this it's really quite lovely. It comes apart and so on. And, but it's a model, an exact replica of the Villa Rotunda of Palladio. And it has the 4 entrances and so on. Behind it, you'll see a piece of artwork that he did in pen and ink, and it's called Squaring the Circle or Circling the Square, which was an exploration he did of some images and graphics and so on. Artwork, so he painted, again, being a Renaissance man, he wasn't just doing architecture. He also painted things like, this is 18 little landscapes in watercolor. He discovered the Xerox machine and made this picture of himself on kind of crumpled dollar bills. And this is, again, the same image of himself times 9. And underneath that, we see some conceptual images that he did while reading. He would be reading a book and he'd have a visual flash of, like this one says page 130 right there. So he'd have a flash of what it would look like, and he'd take out his paints and paint it. And then he'd describe what he was seeing. And I love this one. It says, and he glimpsed for a moment through the trees the lanky Pierrot, you know what that means, tenderly carrying a limp human form. So, you know, that was just an exercise in fun. Anyway, this is about the, this is when he was at Rockefeller Center. He was asked to do their Christmas card. So he did this Christmas card in 1974, and there's the original card, and this is the story he wrote about it. He says, last fall, my company, Rockefeller Center, asked me to design the corporate Christmas card. Not wanting to do the usual trite Christmas tree or sleigh, I looked around the center and found a suitably Christmassy subject in sculpture Lee Laurie's pierced screen over the south entrance of the International Building. It depicts international commerce, I think, but what attracted me was the top part, which showed the Big Dipper constellation. I abstracted this section with the result you see as a glossy white card with silver mirror background, out of which shine the stars and their curved halos. So that's the image. The card was a success, but it was not until a few weeks ago that I realized how profoundly my unconscious had shaped this design. This is written in 1975. Consider first the obvious symbolism. He was very interested in symbolism and Jungian kind of issues. I won't read the whole thing, but it's a fascinating thing. Okay, now let's talk about, I want to add one last thing, Frank, is that back when he worked for Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, he designed a building for Brookhaven Laboratories, and he designed 2 curved buildings, and he clad them in green glass. And the head of design at that time at SOM was named Gordon Bunshaft, and he said to him, young man, at Skidmore we don't do curved buildings, and we only use the primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. Occasionally we use the corporate colors, white, black, and gold. As for green, young man, green is for grass. So that was kind of an interesting story about Skidmore. We can put that back in the other section. So now I want to talk about the sailing part here. Let's get rid of that. And Frank, take a picture of that panel while I get organized here. So we're going to start here. My father started sailing in 1950. His first boat he bought in 1950. And he bought many, many boats after that and built many boats. Sailing was always extremely important to him. And this is a presentation he did for Webb Institute in Long Island, talking about his design process. He called it Confessions of a Wet and Dry Architect. And this is his first boat trilogy. He taught himself naval architecture. He also taught himself to sail by being a cook on sailboats. He sailed in the Bermudas race, and he won something called the Corinthian Cup. And the Corinthian Cup is given to the slowest boat, the last boat to come in, because the theory is, he was cook on the last boat, and the theory is that the reason they came in last is they were so busy eating they didn't sail. So he won the Corinthian Cup for being the cook on the slowest boat to Bermuda. But he did learn to sail. He did teach himself naval architecture. And his very first boat, he built some boats in his garage. His first one was called Thesis, because he felt it was his graduation. He then designed this boat trilogy, which won a lot of races. And Trilogy was launched. I'm going to show you more about Trilogy when we get further along in the presentation. But she was very, very fast and won a lot of races, most notably at New York Yacht Club and Indian Harbor Yacht Club. And but she was bought by Tartan, and she became the Tartan 26. Her design became the Tartan 26, which was in fiberglass. But she was fast in wood and slow in fiberglass, which happens. But still 100 of them were made and sold. So Trilogy was a great success. Frank, I want to show the next. This is another boat he designed in the 70s, 1979, called the X-21, not the Cup. It's a different thing. The X-21 was a day sailor that was competitive with the J-22. And Frank, here's the X-21 under sail. And for a while, I owned Excellent. They all had X in their title, and in their name, I should say. And she stayed in Stonington Harbor. And that's her sailing off of Fisher's Island up there. So, X-21. I want to show you then, this is Scarab, which was one of his early boats, and it won the Indian Harbor Yacht Club three races, first and second, and this would have, then there's a trophy of it as well, silver trophy. This is continuing the story of Trilogy. Trilogy was built in Stamford, Connecticut at Chris Christensen's yard. Chris was a Norwegian boat builder, and my father and it was my father's first design. He looks like he's something out of Mad Men, the way he's holding his cigarette. Anyway, this is my dad with Trilogy at the dock when she was launched. Very fast boat. This is Trilogy's half hull, which was, as I said, was bought and became the Tradition 26, which was Tartan's name for her. But basically it was Trilogy's design. And here's some architectural nautical drawings of Trilogy. And then, Frank, if you, yeah, that's Nimble. Let's zoom in over on Trilogy under sail, and then we'll come on to Nimble. So now he's becoming quite an experienced boat designer. He did many other boats, some of which were built, some were not. Then he built for himself. I want to show you this picture back here. This is Nimble. This was a boat that he built in the early 80s. And Nimble was built in a barn in Chester. She was cold molded. He built it for himself. This is Nimble, who also stayed for a long time in Stonington Harbor. Nimble still sails. She's up in Newport right now, winning all the races. She was cold molded in a barn in Chester and brought down to Stonington Harbor. Very fast boat, 30 feet long, Nimble 30. And I have some images of Nimble under sail with her spinnaker up. And we also have some of Nimble's designs, her shape and so on. She was very fast. And we have some images of Nimble as she left the barn where she was built. So I think we've covered pretty much. I want to end with talking about reading something he wrote about why he did creative things. And this was written in 1970. And it says, "We are reaching past Green's Ledge Light, going fast," which is, it's late afternoon in the spring of 1970. The mainsail is eased, the Genoa full, the wind about 12 from the southwest, sun warm on the shoulders. I walk forward along the deck to be alone with my joy. Trilogy, the boat we are sailing home today from her first trials, is my creation. She is my firstborn design, built by Chris, the Danish craftsman, midwife by friend and supporter Ted, the Trilogy after whom she is named. Under my feet, I sense her lightness, her power, the liquid flow past her belly. Aft, I see the flat wake telling of barely disturbed water as she passes. She flies better than my secret fantasy. I hear the bows rush and gurgle bounce off the sails. I remember the hours with pencil, batten, and wood. She is alive and came from my gut. And then I feel compelled to turn, and there, standing on Trilogy's foredeck, and as I do, it hits me like it did so many other times. My hair stands up on my neck, unspeakable bliss inside of me. As I turn, I know something I didn't know before, and I'm transformed by this knowledge. And yet I feel I have learned something I already knew. So he spent a lot of time thinking and talking about his creative process. He was always working. I think that's one of the reasons that he was more comfortable with work than he was with people. And he went through a number of wives and children, so on, because for him it was all about the work, about the creativity, and he was always bubbling over with creativity, whether it was art or theater or architecture or poetry. It's just never ended. So again, if he were still here, he'd 99 this year, 100 next year, 1922. He died in 2016 in Bristol, Rhode Island, where he had gone because of Herreshoff. And he was a remarkable man, and he will be missed. Thank you.